Live from London, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden, and these are your top stories. President Trump says the US needs total access to Venezuela following the capture of President Nicolas Maduro. Acting President Delcy Rodríguez says that she's inviting the US to work with her. Oil swings as traders weigh the impact of Maduro's capture. President Trump says US companies will spend billions of dollars to rebuild Venezuela's energy infrastructure. And Denmark's Prime Minister urges the US to stop threatening to take control of Greenland after Trump's Venezuela actions set alarm bells ringing in the Nordic nation. Well, we have markets starting the week by taking geopolitics in their stride. We have Asian markets already higher by 1.5%. Futures pointing higher on both sides of the Atlantic as well. And oil fluctuating. Brent now down 0.6% at $60 a barrel. Your risk events this week include a big speech by the Nvidia boss Jensen Huang later on today. Over the course of the next 2 days, we'll have UK talks continuing in Paris among leaders of the Coalition of the Willing. Events in Venezuela perhaps casting a new light on security guarantees. And then on Friday, the main data print of the week, the US December jobs report. With all of that in mind, let's set you up for your week. We begin with our top story. President Donald Trump says that the US needs, quote, total access to Venezuela and its oil to rebuild the country following the capture of President Nicolas Maduro. The US swooped into Caracas over the weekend, seizing Maduro and flying him to New York to face drugs and weapons charges.
We need total access. We need access to the oil and to other things in their country that allow us to rebuild their country.
In a statement on Sunday, Venezuela's acting president Delcy Rodríguez invited the US to work together on a cooperation agenda aimed at shared development within the framework of international law. For more, Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson joins me now. Ros, good morning. President Trump says that the US plans to run Venezuela, so I wonder what that's likely to entail.
Well, the word run does sound a bit like running a corporation, doesn't it? But in this case, really, it's not necessarily about installing a certain administration or even having elections. It's about making sure whoever's in charge in Venezuela is adhering to US policy goals. And those seem to be two things, which is stopping the flow of drugs into the US and also allowing essentially the US to gain control of Venezuela's energy infrastructure, its oil industry, and to rebuild that, and obviously then in the long term to benefit from it, giving US even further certainty around supply. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has also talked about it as a policy priority when he talks about running. So whoever's in charge needs to adhere to those US goals. And the US doesn't seem inclined to get fully pulled into Venezuela, which is obviously a country in high chaos and has been for a long time with a crippled economy. It doesn't seem to want US troops on the ground there. But the question is, if things do deteriorate in Venezuela, it's very unclear exactly who's in charge. Is the vice president able to form a government and stay in charge? You know, do things descend into chaos? Is the US pulled in, even if they don't want to be, in a further interventionist way? But for now, at least, they're saying it's about really ensuring whoever is in charge in Venezuela is adhering to those US policy goals.
And Ros, as we consider what comes next, of course, President Trump has weighed in once again on the future of Greenland. Take a listen to this.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
So, Ros, could Greenland be next on Trump's list?
Well, obviously, he's had his eye on Greenland for a while. This predated Venezuela, and this has been a mantra of his about Greenland. He says that Greenland's close to the US. He needs it from a national security perspective, especially given the developments in the Arctic. And also, obviously, not lost to anybody is that Greenland has a lot of natural resources. And he says that Denmark, of course, is not in a position to govern Greenland. And Greenland doesn't belong to Denmark, therefore it may as well belong to the US. But these are much more complex questions. I mean, Greenland's not run or wasn't run by a dictator who repressed his people and crippled his economy. It's run by a government that's been elected, so it's much more complex. Maduro was not popular with many people, including inside and out Venezuela. So perhaps his removal is less difficult for the US, but it's much more complicated to talk about changes in Greenland. But does the US now push for a greater military presence in Greenland, for example? Does it push for greater access to its natural resources? What does control actually mean in this case? It's a bit difficult to say, but obviously Trump is still very much fixated on Greenland either way.
And while we're thinking about what's next potentially for President Trump, we're also thinking about the inspiration other leaders could be taking from these actions in Venezuela. Perhaps President Xi in Taiwan or President Putin in Ukraine. Could it be a template?
Well, Putin, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, obviously thinks already that he can string Donald Trump along and get away with things, which he's been doing for a while in Ukraine. And the difference being Russia has troops on the ground in Ukraine and wants to take and hold territory. For China, obviously looking at this, they've got business interests in Latin America, so they might be a bit uneasy about what's been going on, and they've certainly protested, at least on the surface, the US actions. But when it comes to Taiwan, perhaps saying, OK, this is a signal maybe the US would not intervene if we were to do something when it comes to Taiwan, or this could be a template for ourselves. No one's really thinking, obviously, that China's about to do something when it comes to Taiwan, but perhaps the messaging is, again, for countries around the world and not just China, is that will the US really come in and intervene in a way that perhaps it would have done under previous administrations? Is Donald Trump willing to let things go or slide, if he sees it in his interest to do so? It's a very different world order that we're coming into with these spheres of influence that we're seeing. Xi Jinping in Asia, Putin in parts of Europe, someone perhaps in the Middle East, and Donald Trump in the Americas. And the message in all of that is don't disrupt our business affairs, but otherwise we'll stay out of each other's way in these spheres of influence around the periphery of these countries. And perhaps China is looking at what's happened with Venezuela and taking that as a sign as well.
All right, Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson, we thank you so much for walking us through the top lines there and the international implications. Turning to the market impact, we've had oil fluctuating as investors weigh the fallout from the ouster of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. The OPEC producer sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, yet it accounts for a small fraction of global supply. For more, joining us now is Bloomberg oil trading reporter Rongwei Neo. Good to see you, Rong. It seems like oil markets had been taking Maduro's capture in their stride, but really were fluctuating this morning.
So today's Brent price movement is testament to how the market is reacting to the latest Maduro's capture. It fluctuated because initially people thought that there were short-term supply risks, but as the market began to digest the pre-existing fundamentals in the oil market, which is the fact that this year global oil markets are slated to a record oversupply, still far outweighs the short-term risks that traders are expecting coming out from this. Moreover, there are a lot of uncertainty clouding this outlook of Venezuela's production and how fast it's going to return to the market. Although Venezuela is one of the OPEC producers, its output has been drastically falling in recent years, ever since the US has sanctioned it and put embargoes and tariffs on it, affecting its ability to grow economically. So there is a bit of optimism from market players as well as analysts in terms of seeing Venezuelan production return back to the market, which could also weigh on today's prices as well.
And of course, OPEC Plus sticking to that supply pause over the weekend because of that global glut that you point out, Rong. Look, Trump wants US companies to invest billions of dollars into Venezuelan oil, but how long realistically would it take that industry to recover?
So, Liz, rightfully you mentioned that Venezuela is sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves. So there's a lot of excitement, and of course, President Trump's calls for U.S. companies to return investments into the country. There's a bit of optimism in the air on increasing production from Venezuela. But let's not forget that exploration and production in the oil business remains something risky, and it's not that easy to bring in infrastructure to allow normal oil production to resume. Venezuela, as an oil-producing nation, has taken years of damage and the lack of growth, and it's going to be a huge undertaking to catch up on all these. So industry estimates point to the fact that a successful drilling, so from the point where a company is looking to seek oil to the point where it extracts its first barrel, could take anytime between a year to two. And more often than not, it's fraught with risks. There are a lot of cases where such production ventures don't actually work out. So although we are seeing a lot of optimism in the air with US companies looking to bring funds into Venezuela, let's not forget that it's going to take a long time before we can see some of the results actually show itself and manifest itself in the physical market.
Rong, really appreciate the context there. Bloomberg's oil trading reporter, Rong Wei Neo. Well, turning to the broader market reaction here, and we can bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel. Val, you've got gold and silver surging this morning. Silver up 3.6%, gold up 1.9%. This, of course, because of the haven demand on the geopolitical risk. But elsewhere, looks like the market reaction is pretty contained.
Yeah, pretty contained. And the equity market rally of Friday is continuing into Monday's session. So not a lot of risk off in these markets. And perhaps this continued rally in precious metals is just a continuation of December's move rather than a safe haven bid. We are seeing the U.S. dollar slightly bid this morning. It's really the only sign in the market that there would be some risk-off nuance here. Now, we were worried perhaps about Asian markets opening up over the weekend due to the fact that I think many people were drawing lines of, if the U.S. is escalating these issues with Venezuela, perhaps this will lead China to escalate issues with Taiwan. We're not seeing that today. If anything, these Asian markets are absolutely flying. Shares of TSMC are up some 5%. So it does seem like risk is on a good footing here. I think it'll be interesting to watch later today how Venezuelan bonds end up trading today. It could give us a good sentiment indicator around perhaps this economic turnaround of Venezuela. Venezuela itself has around 150 billion of defaulted bonds. Now, some of these bonds have already doubled amidst the U.S. pressure on Venezuela in the last few months. Volumes are still very low in this kind of frontier market. But if there was a real belief that this leadership change could lead to an economic turnaround in Venezuela, we could see Venezuelan bonds trading up to recovery value, which is around 60 cents on the dollar. The bonds we're showing are on screen right now are trading around 33 cents on the dollar. So defaulted debt of Venezuela might be something key looking forward to just how much the market really does believe in this economic turnaround of Venezuela, which is also tied into how quickly it can get that oil out of the ground.
Yeah, and you can see those bonds really gaining since President Trump came back to office. We're going to come back to Asian markets in just a moment, but of course we're looking to another risk event at the end of the week, and that's the US jobs report for December.
Yeah, US jobs report for December is going to be released as normal on a normal Friday at 1:30 p.m. Back to a normal schedule when it comes to US data. Now, I think for the market is they're quite excited to get a print that maybe has less noise in it. We've had a fair few prints that have had many complicating factors due to the U.S. government shutdown. So if we do get a clean report and it does in some way confirm that, yes, the labor market is on a weakening trend, but not necessarily dropping off a cliff, that could be something that could add comfort to this Fed on pause narrative that they really opened the door to back in their December meeting. There is other risk events this week. I think tech is going to be a big focus. We do have the Consumer Electronic Showcase happening in Las Vegas, the Consumer Electronics Show, sorry. We do hear from the NVIDIA CEO and the AMD CEO later today. That is going to be key. Tech is already out of the gates really strong this week. Perhaps they will have some comments about the recent IPOs of Chinese chip companies that are, I guess, threatening their dominance in Asian markets. So they've been pulling out of China due to those geopolitical concerns. Also, we have Samsung preliminary results this week. Samsung shares have hit a record high, new record high this week. Those preliminary results are on Thursday.
right, Val, thank you so much for that. Well, you head me off to Asia. Of course, Asia is already trading. Let's get an update from Winnie Zhu in Hong Kong. Winnie, it seems, as Val says, the tech optimism continuing where you are.
Yeah, exactly. We see that the MSCI Asia here up more than 1.5%. And it really is how investors are looking past these geopolitical risks and digesting the Venezuela news pretty quickly and refocusing on that tech rally, which has been extending since last year. And hence you can see here that the tech heavy indexes here across the board are leading gains, specifically Japan's Nikkei 225 up more than 3% on its first day of trading in 2026. And also similarly, benchmarks in South Korea up more than 3% and in Taiwan up more than 2.6%. And both indexes are also headed for their new record highs. Now we flip the board and take a look at the top gainer, the top contributor to the index's gain today, which is Samsung Electronics. So it is up more than 6% today. But really, when you take a look at how it has been performing in the past several years, really underperforming its global peers and Asia peers, but really seeing that very sharp rebound recently. And like we mentioned just now, it is a lot of expectations around its earnings as we look ahead for its preliminary earnings on Thursday. And analysts are already raising target price for the stock. And just on Friday, we have the CEO on his New Year's speech saying that Samsung is back and that its HBM for chips are gaining a lot of customers' feedback, and those feedbacks are mainly these compliments that really boosted the overall optimism for the chips from Samsung. But also on top of that, you've got the corporate governance still gaining more momentum, and overall you also have all eyes on that CES show that we're talking about, which we're going to see Samsung unveiling some of these new technologies. Now flip the board, we also want to take a look at some of the other Asia chip names, and specifically highlighting TSMC here up more than 5%. And that's after Goldman Sachs raising its target price by 35%, citing that AI is going to be that multi-year growth engine for the stock.
Okay, Winnie, thank you so much. That's Winnie Zhu in Hong Kong with a look at Asia markets there. Coming up on the programme, gold and silver gaining as investors weigh heightened political risk in Venezuela. We'll talk metals next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. We're staying with the market reaction to the news around Venezuela. We have gold and silver jumping on the geopolitical risk as trade uncertainty spurs buying following the US capture of Nicolas Maduro. Bloomberg's metals and mining reporter Martin Ritchie joins us now from Shanghai. Martin, I wonder if these gains for gold and silver are actually likely to last, if this is a quick closure rather than a prolonged military conflict, as some analysts are suggesting.
It's an interesting question, and I would probably take a step back and look at this much more beyond just Venezuela and more about what the Trump action there kind of says about the global environment. I think Bloomberg's big take story today was that this action shows that the new world order is here. His very now clear bid to remake the sort of rules of the global order show that a kind of new world is emerging, a new kind of geopolitics, and in that big take, mentions a kind of almost a new imperialism, as one of the analysts is quoted as saying. In this environment where everything is so uncertain, the relationships between the US and China, between US and Europe, between all the major blocs, gold is doing what it's always done. It's a hedge against geopolitical uncertainty. So, you can sort of look at today and say, gold's rising because of what's happened in Venezuela, but I think it goes much deeper than that in terms of what's happening with the broader environment. And in that context, I think we can say, and I think most people have said over the past few weeks already, that gold is well positioned for the rest of this year. Given that kind of context and given worries also about sovereign debt and a weaker US dollar, these are all things that are conspiring to make gold attractive, I guess.
Well, yeah, walk us through that broader environment then, because Goldman's base case is for gold to hit $4,900 a troy ounce this year. What other factors will boost the precious metals then?
So if we I was talking about the broader environment, but just to look at the sort of underlying drivers for gold, the two things kind of stand out. Central bank buying and investor flows into exchange traded funds backed by gold. So on central bank buying, a major driver over the past 2 years, and especially last year, you had China especially buying a lot of gold, but all over the world, central banks wanting to diversify their foreign reserve holdings away from just the US dollar to hold gold. That's very much expected to continue, and again, very much emboldened by all the geopolitical uncertainty, the geopolitical changes we're seeing unfolding. And then if we look at ETF flows, the exchange traded fund flows, they're actually a relatively small portion of US private investment holdings, for example. So it wouldn't take much for, say, a chunk of US private investors to move their holdings into gold, to say they want more of gold, to make big moves in the gold price. So those are the two kind of, I guess, trading reasons why gold's also supported this year.
All right, and we're also seeing copper surging towards another record, Martin, because of the tariff concerns and that broader risk-on mood that we've been discussing. Good to see you, Martin. Happy New Year. That's Martin Ritchie in Shanghai. We thank you. Well, coming up on the programme, what does the US action in Venezuela mean for big oil? We'll discuss that later in the show. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now to other top stories we're following around the world this morning. US airlines have begun resuming their Caribbean operations after the US military incursion in Venezuela triggered airspace closures across the region. Both American Airlines and Delta Airlines said that they've added extra flights and seats to accommodate displaced customers. Elsewhere, North Korea's Kim Jong-un oversaw the test of hypersonic missiles a day after the US seized Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. Pyongyang denounced the American move as a rogue and brutal violation of international laws. North Korea said the missiles hit targets 1,000 kilometres away. And here in the UK, the Prime Minister has warned his governing Labour Party that removing him in 2026 would plunge Britain into chaos and open the door to a far-right government. Keir Starmer said any instability would be a gift to Nigel Farage, the populist leader of Reform UK, who currently tops opinion polls. Well, those are some of our top stories this morning, but coming up, we'll dive more deeply into the wider implications of Trump's ouster of Maduro and what it means for national security. That conversation with Roxanna, Vigil, an international affairs fellow for the Council on Foreign Relations, coming up next. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Live from London, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden with your top stories. President Trump says the US needs total access to Venezuela following the capture of President Nicolas Maduro. Acting President Delcy Rodríguez says she's inviting the US to work with her. Oil swings as traders weigh the impact of Maduro's capture. President Trump says US companies will spend billions of dollars to rebuild Venezuela's energy infrastructure. And Denmark's Prime Minister urges the US to stop threatening to take control of Greenland after Trump's Venezuela actions set alarm bells ringing in the Nordic nation. Well, markets start the week taking the geopolitics in their stride. We have Asian stocks at a record on the tech optimism, futures pointing higher on both sides of the Atlantic. And oil has been fluctuating, but now lower on Brent. We're down 0.5% at $60 a barrel. Time as well to look at this morning's front pages, which are unsurprisingly dominated by Venezuela. The Financial Times reports that the pressure remains on Venezuela's acting president after Donald Trump told Delcy Rodríguez she may pay an even bigger price than Nicolas Maduro if, quote, she doesn't do what's right. The Wall Street Journal also leads on Venezuela, reporting that the White House was fed up with repeated efforts to persuade Maduro to leave office. Hence, he decided in favour of military action. And if we look at the UK's Daily Telegraph, they're speculating about Trump's next target, the paper quoting his interview with the Atlantic magazine in which he said, quote, "We do need Greenland, we need it for defence." Well, you can get a roundup of the top stories you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak. Bloomberg Terminal subscribers can find it by going to DAYB Go. Now, let's dive into that top story of the day. The ousting of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is putting America's allies and adversaries on notice that President Trump has a new world order of his own. Joining me now, I'm pleased to say, is Roxanna Vigil, International Affairs Fellow at the independent, non-partisan think tank, the Council on Foreign Relations. Good to see you, Roxanna. Thank you for staying up late for us. This is the opposite of what you were recommending should happen in Venezuela in your last note in December. President Trump says that he wants to run the country from the US. What do you expect that'll mean in practice?
There's a lot of concern right now because, of course, without specifics on what that means, that is extremely impractical. So the big question is, what is the plan for a democratic transition in Venezuela? Is the Trump administration going to prioritize working with a Maduro regime insider, which is in charge right now, and it will essentially continue a lot of the most egregious practices such as repression and the different dictatorial behaviors of the Maduro regime? Or is the Trump administration going to lay out a roadmap for a transition to democracy, be it with Edmundo González, who is the winner of the 2024 presidential election in Venezuela that Maduro stole, or through facilitating elections in Venezuela in the short term? None of that's been laid out. I'm concerned that the Trump administration, it sounds like they are not prioritizing a democratic transition at this time and instead prioritizing oil.
But do you think there'll be American boots and administrators on the ground in Caracas?
That's not clear. It's not clear what running the country means, to having total access, being in control of the country. None of that is clear. So far, the Trump administration, President Trump and different senior officials have indicated that U.S. oil companies will invest in Venezuela. But the reality is that Venezuela's oil sector has been on decline for over 10 years. And it will take many years to rebuild the sector, including structural changes, potentially new laws, and a new economic framework to attract that investment, for investors to feel confident in investing in Venezuela, given the history there.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that corporate side in just a moment. But I wonder how compliant you expect acting President Delcy Rodríguez to be with Washington.
I think she's in a bind. On the one hand, in order to be seen as effective within her own political system, she needs to be able to secure the loyalty of the military as well as the hardliners within the Maduro regime, or the Chavista regime now, since Maduro's gone. And on the other hand, she is going to need to capitulate to the Trump administration's demands. And that, of course, will weaken her position within her own political movement. So I think it's going to be very difficult for her to govern. Another reason why it's imperative that there be some sort of plan for a democratic transition, because Delcy Rodríguez has a weak mandate, and there's a high risk that due to that weak mandate and due to the divisions within Chavismo, within the regime, that we could see a lot of instability, we could see an increase in violence, we could see a lot of uncertainty in the coming days and weeks.
Well, since you mentioned that weak mandate, I just want to play you a bit of a conversation that the Michelle Hussein show on Bloomberg had with the Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. This was in October. Take a listen.
We have everything, and we are ready to take over government. That's very important as well. We have the teams, we have the plans, we need what we are to do the first 100 hours, the first 100 days, and certainly we now need the international community aligned with the United States, because this is a transnational conflict and operation.
So, Roxanna, President Trump says that she doesn't have the support to govern. She says she's ready. What's your take?
I think there's a lot of surprise by President Trump's dismissal of, his dismissive tone of Maria Corina Machado. She did win the opposition primary in 2023. She was not allowed to run because Maduro saw her as a real threat. So instead, she graciously backed Edmundo Gonzalez, who eventually did win those presidential elections. So I don't think that saying that the opposition does not have the support of the Venezuelan people it reflects reality, given that the Venezuelan people voted for Edmundo Gonzalez. They voted against Maduro. They're ready to turn the page on Chavismo. So having the Trump administration now not start this new phase of Venezuela with outright support for the opposition and with a plan to transition to a democratic Venezuela is a betrayal of so much that the Venezuelan opposition has done to return Venezuela to democracy.
OK, Roxanna, really great to get your insights this morning. Roxanna Vigil from the Council on Foreign Relations out of Washington. We thank you so much. Well, President Trump has signalled that American oil companies will play a greater role in Venezuela and that they'll spend billions of dollars to rebuild the infrastructure.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
However, there are suggestions that the US president's plan could be a long and arduous process, costing upwards of $100 billion. Well, Sally Yilmaz, senior oil analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, joins me now with more from Dubai. Good morning to you. I wonder how willing US oil companies will actually be to rebuild Venezuelan oil infrastructure when, as we've been hearing throughout the programme, Sally, the political future is just so uncertain.
Good morning. Good question, and the answer is that we don't know yet. There hasn't really been an announcement from the likes of Exxon or Chevron. I suspect we may get an announcement in the coming weeks. But these companies would be looking for political certainty alongside operational certainty. These are big investment decisions. And the question is, could there be a directive from the White House for these companies to make these investment decisions? And it's important to remember these are private companies trying to maximize shareholder value. So they really will need to have that political stability, that security, and on top of all of that, very favorable terms for them to be incentivized to even consider going into Venezuela.
Yeah, exactly. With oil prices already relatively low, surely more supply would just drive them lower. So what could that directive look like to incentivize those companies to invest in Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And, the argument we've been making is that maybe for spot prices, this is not going to change much. But when you look at the back end of the oil curve, which is where the oil companies' investment decisions are made, that's probably going to flatten a little bit. There's going to be a lot more pressure on that. And as you already mentioned, this is already a pretty soft pricing environment. And also important to remember, this is heavy oil, generally tends to have higher break-even costs. So it's going to be interesting to see how these companies are incentivized. And also, very important to note, a lot of these companies, not just US oil majors, but globally, these companies have been having very cautious capex plans, and they've been prioritizing shareholder returns. So do they change strategy, or do they kind of try to reroute some of the spending that was supposed to go elsewhere to other projects into Venezuela? It's going to be very interesting to see.
Well, yeah, interesting to see Chevron indicated higher this morning on TradeGate. Already, of course, it operates there under waivers from sanctions. I wonder which other US companies could play a greater role in Venezuela, Sally. And what about European firms? Are they likely to expand production with Maduro out? I'm thinking of the likes of Spain's Repsol and Italy's Eni.
Exxon and ConocoPhillips are the two names that come to mind. I'd say, President Trump in the press conference did say big oil companies, so we really are looking at some of these majors. And these two companies were present in Venezuela previously. They had their assets seized and nationalized. So there's certainly perhaps not the operational upside that Chevron has, but immediately there is some legal upside for these companies. And if the terms are good enough, and if there's security, stability that we talked about, they could consider going back in. In terms of the European names, as you mentioned, Eni and Repsol are the names who are already there. But these companies are already operating in compliance with sanctions. So I don't think they really do have similar legal or operational upside compared to the US companies.
OK, Sally, good to see you. Thank you so much for that context. That's Sally Yilmaz from Bloomberg Intelligence there. Well, coming up, what stocks should you be watching in 2026? We highlight some of the top 50 from Bloomberg Intelligence Analysis next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now to our top corporate news. President Donald Trump and Elon Musk have seemingly rekindled their relationship after their public fallout last year. The Tesla CEO Musk writing on X that he had a, quote, lovely dinner with President Trump and the First Lady over the weekend. The photo was taken on Saturday evening at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. Elsewhere, Xiaomi has raised its 2026 EV delivery target to 550,000 units, a 34% increase from last year. The company's push into EVs turned profitable in November, about 18 months after it launched its first electric sedan, less than half the time it took Tesla to reach that milestone. Even so, Xiaomi was one of the worst performing tech stocks last year as investors worried about challenges facing China's EV industry, including overcapacity and weak demand. And Bloomberg understands that Airbus delivered 793 aircraft in 2025, exceeding its revised annual target. Sources say that the figures are preliminary and may slightly yet change. Airbus cut its previous 2025 guidance of about 820 handovers last month after a series of glitches involving its best-selling A320 model, including a massive recall for a software upgrade. Well, those are some of our top corporate stories this morning. Now, let's dive into individual stocks. After tracking thousands of companies from different industries around the globe, Bloomberg Intelligence has compiled a list of 50 worth watching carefully over the year ahead, for better or for worse. Tim Craighead, who leads the team responsible for this, joins me now from Bloomberg Intelligence. Happy New Year, Tim.
Indeed.
So how do you come up with 50? How do you wiggle it down?
Yeah, it's a key question. This list of 50 comes from a broader group of what we call focus ideas. traps. There are about 120 of these currently. These are high conviction ideas that we think we've got a differentiated view, out of consensus view, and importantly, they're catalysts ahead that can change the market's point of view. We don't want value traps. These 50 have catalysts or triggers that are coming up that are important in 2026. And it's a nice broad base across sectors, across regions. There's positives, there's negatives. You find all of them on BI Focus on the terminal. So
nice
give that
plug.
little plug. But yeah, that's how they come about.
Okay, so we were talking about how in geopolitics things feel very different in 2026. Talk of a new world order.
Yeah.
But when it comes to AI, we've also been talking about the optimism already in Asia markets this morning. Is it a different AI story for stocks that you're watching this year?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, you think about 2024 and 25, a lot of the focus was on the big LLMs for obvious reasons. We've been looking for sort of secondary or supporting plays that, you know, maybe are a little bit more undiscovered. So think about in semiconductors, you know, NVIDIA is well known, but TSMC, Samsung, Marvell in the semiconductor space are on our list, not NVIDIA. Think about what's going on from the overall infrastructure build out. And there you've got companies like ACS, which you might not even know, but it's a Spanish construction company, but they own a U.S. subsidiary that is the leading builder of data centers. So things along those lines are how we're thinking about AI.
Well, we'll be hearing from Jensen Huang, the NVIDIA boss, later on today in Las Vegas. I wonder if he can say anything that'll excite you, Tim. What are these products and innovations and CEOs then that are exciting you?
Yeah, so new product innovations is actually the largest category on our list. And there's healthcare names, a couple of biotech names, one that feeds into a heart condition, one that helps dwarfism. There's consumer product companies that are very well known, but with important new lines coming up. Think Nike, think Canada Goose. Decker, you might not know, but they're the ones who own UGG and Hoka.
I know them.
Yes, you do indeed. So there's a number of new product innovation stories. And of course, you can't get away from new management. Both Sodexo, the big food service company here in Europe, as well as Diageo, the Scotch maker, among other things that they do. Both have new CEOs on board. Both have big challenges after 2 years of negative earnings revisions that we think is ready to inflect.
Okay. Well, as you say, you can find all of that research on BI Go on the terminal. Tim Craighead, thank you so much, Global Chief Content Officer for Bloomberg Intelligence. Plenty more coming up. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Without the rest of the Chavista regime, the rest of the Maduro regime staying in power, without changes to the corrupt system that has led to so much of the deterioration in the oil sector, in the rest of the economy, if none of that changes, I wouldn't expect to see any meaningful changes in Venezuela.
In fact, I think some of the lessons that we have learned from past nation-building exercises is as long as stability on the ground exists from local forces, there is no need for United States military forces.
So I think in the short term, what we're likely to see is supply disruptions in Venezuela. And in the long term, we could see additional barrels of oil from Venezuela in the long term. I don't think that this is a matter of 1-2 years. I think we're talking about 5 to 8 years.
There's a quarantine right now in which sanctioned oil shipments, there's a boat and that boat is under U.S. sanctions. We go get a court order, we will seize it. That remains in place. And that's a tremendous amount of leverage that will continue to be in place until we see changes that not just further the national interest of the United States, which is number one, but also that lead to a better future for the people of Venezuela.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio on US plans for Venezuela's oil, and Bloomberg TV guest there weighing the impact of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's ousting on global crude supply. Well, let's translate all of that into charts, shall we? In our last few minutes here, you can see that Venezuelan bonds have been rallying really ever since President Donald Trump came back into office. He's been putting real pressure on Maduro, and they're expected to rally even more in the coming weeks and months. But a lot of this, of course, will depend on the debt restructuring, and it will depend on whether Trump can persuade American oil producers to come in and invest those billions of dollars that he says they will into the company's oil industry. Flip the board over, and yes, Venezuela has the world's biggest oil reserves, but as you can see here, ever since 2015, production has been dwindling. It's not what it once was. And this is the opportunity gap that is there for the likes of Chevron to take up. But flip over one more time. And the broader context here, of course, is that Venezuela is an OPEC Plus member, and OPEC Plus has on its mind the analyst expectation of a global glut. Hence why over the weekend we had the OPEC Plus meeting, continuing with this supply pause. Is it that actually you won't be able to get those oil producers into Venezuela if the reality is you've got lower oil prices? All of these charts you can find on the Bloomberg terminal by typing CHRT TV Go. You can find all the charts that we'll be using on Bloomberg TV there. And let's have a reminder, shall we, of the major risk events ahead this week. Today, we've got the Nvidia boss Jensen Huang speaking in Las Vegas. Today and tomorrow, the Ukraine talks continue in Paris among leaders of the Coalition of the Willing. Events in Venezuela perhaps casting a new light on those security guarantees. And then on Friday, it's the big main data print of the week, the US December jobs report, of course. Will it be cleaner? Will it be less noise and more signal this time, we ask? Well, coming up right here on Bloomberg TV, our US colleagues will be speaking exclusively with the former US Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. That exclusive conversation starting at 3 p.m. UK time. And a reminder that later this week, Bloomberg Tech Europe looks at how AI is shaking up the music industry. The episode featuring an exclusive interview with the Grammy-winning artist will.i.am. That's at 8:30 a.m. UK time this Friday, right here on Bloomberg TV. But before all that, the opening trade's coming up next with Anna Guy and now Tom McKenzie. They'll take you all the way to the European market open. See you tomorrow here on Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.